Welcome, everybody, especially this great Latin America crowd. First, can everybody hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this morning. This is a picture of a sea cucumber, which I'm excited to learn more about today from Shawn, our presenter from Measuring Impact. Sea cucumbers are our example in the results chain presentation today, so this is what we're talking about. We are recording this webinar, and if we will send around the link later today or tomorrow, so that if you wanted to share with any of your colleagues who couldn't make it, you can certainly do so. If you want to go to the next slide, Shawn.
Sure.
This is our conservation enterprise theory of change. I think we've seen it before. And the topic of our presentation today is how we can use this results chain process beyond program design, but really as part of MENL, the monitoring, evaluation, and learning in particular. So Shawn, I'm going to pass it over to you. Please do use the chat box for your questions. I think we can open it up. We'll experiment with opening it up to see if we can manage the echo and feedback lines just so we can have a discussion. I do hope that several colleagues on this webinar, including Luis and El Salvador, and I'm expecting Carl Wooster to join us, to provide some commentary toward the end and really have a discussion across participants about how evaluating your conservation enterprise programs might take advantage of this TOC approach. As I noted early on, as we were getting started, this is a work in progress. I really do hope that you'll use the chat box and give us feedback on the presentation, particularly on concepts that aren't clear to you or areas that you have questions on, or just things that you want to talk about. And we will certainly make sure to have time in our hour today for that. So please, Shawn, over to you.
Great, thank you, Megan. So this is our familiar friend, this theory of change. And as Megan mentioned, we want to talk about how you can use this more than what we've already used it for in this learning group, which was to help us develop a learning agenda as an organizing framework for the collaborative learning group. I want to talk about how this can be used to do monitoring, evaluation, learning, and adaptive management within a project. So a little bit more detail there. And the reason this is important is conservation enterprises are a very common approach within USAID biodiversity funding. A recent survey of biodiversity strategic approaches in Tier 1 missions found that 22% of strategic approaches included linked or alternative livelihoods, most of which I think would qualify for what we call conservation enterprises. And that makes it the 6th most common strategic approach in Tier 1 missions for USAID. So a lot of investment and effort going into this, as I'm sure all of you already know. And then there's a huge need for more and better learning around conservation enterprises. There was a recent systematic review by Dilys Rowe and colleagues that looked at the whole literature around alternative livelihoods and their effectiveness in achieving biodiversity outcomes, and found that the structure and results of most of these projects have not been documented in a way that can be captured. So we really don't know what the impacts are, and that's because we're not doing enough high-quality monitoring and evaluation, or perhaps these strategies are not as effective as we think or we hope. But we don't know unless we do better monitoring and evaluation. If you want to find out more about this, there's a webinar that we did for this learning group about a year ago with the author of this paper, with Dilys Rowe and her colleague. And that's a really interesting webinar where she really dives into what they did and what they found. So I'd highly recommend you all to check that out. And that's on our learning group website. We'll try and get the link into the chat box soon. So again, I just want to hit on this need for more and better learning. not just so that we understand the impact of the projects that we have, but also because it's important in running and managing projects. And there recently was a study by World Bank that looked at 1,300 projects and found that high quality monitoring and evaluation was significantly and positively associated with project outcomes. And that's a little bit counterintuitive, but I think that it does make sense that the better monitoring and evaluation you do, the better chance you have of being able to adapt and succeed with your project. And of course, USAID realizes this and has a long history of promoting learning approaches. Currently, the Bureau of Policy Planning and Learning is working to institutionalize their framework of collaboration, learning, and adapting, which I doubt is new to any of you. You'll recognize that circle on the right, I'm sure. I just want to hit on some of the key concepts that they highlight, which are having monitoring data be highly relevant to decision making, having evaluations inform ongoing and future programming, and aligning monitoring, evaluation, and learning efforts across the strategy, project, and activity levels. And what we're going to talk about today is one way to try and help get that relevance and the alignment within a conservation enterprise projects. So then this also comes from PPL, and they see monitoring and evaluation as really flowing from your theory of change. And this is the idea of today's webinars, is to get specific about how you do this. But in general, you have your theory of change for your project or your activity. And then from there, you can identify your technical and behavioral assumptions or your knowledge gaps within that theory of change. And you can also identify contextual factors that might shift and impact your theory. From there, you can identify a set of learning questions. And from your learning questions, you can identify what are the best ways to address or answer these questions. And there's a multitude of options there, from evaluations to research over to peer-to-peer learning and other things. And then from your activities, you can also be thinking about then your utilizations. How are you going to use that knowledge to share your knowledge with others who can use it? And then also, really importantly, to use it to inform your decision making and your adaptive management. And then something that's not on here, but we think is a benefit of this theory of change approach, and maybe it just falls within the theory of change at the top there, but is you can use your theory of change to identify performance and impact metrics that can be used for reporting. So your standard indicators or your custom indicators, things that would fill out your log frame for reporting, can also be pulled from your theory of change to have one integrated package. So in today's presentation, we're going to talk about operationalizing this. So going from the theory of change from our learning group, and then thinking about how you can use this to be developing your core products for MENL, your plans and evaluation scopes of work, and then also how that can be used to direct planning for knowledge products and then experiential learning. And this is something that we've done with this learning group. We've got our theory of change, we've got measuring impact as an MEL plan, measuring impact has done a evaluation, and then we produce knowledge products, some of which you'll see today, and then experiential learning, for example, this webinar. And then, excuse me, this is the outline for today's presentation. What we're going to talk about is we're going to work through these sort of prompting questions that take you through this process. So starting with what are we trying to achieve, and that's how to develop a theory of change. Then moving to how we know if we've achieved that. Thinking about the performance reporting, impact reporting, and measurement. What are our knowledge gaps? What do we know? Excuse me. What don't we know? And then what do we want to know? So specifically from those knowledge gaps, what are the questions that we have that we need to get answered? And then thinking about how are we going to apply this, gather that information, and then start to use it. So that's the general outline. And to do this, we're going to go through, we're going to use an example from my life because it's a very simple theory of change. And I'm simplifying even further from the real life example. But this, many of you don't know me, but I am the skinny guy back there in the corner. This is a few years ago. I lived in Madagascar for 9 years. It's where I started my conservation career. I worked for an organization called Blue Ventures, and we worked with traditional fishing communities on the western coast of Madagascar to try and conserve marine resources and then also to help people out of poverty. That's Blue Ventures' mission. And one of the key ways that we did this was through conservation enterprises. And our flagship conservation enterprise was sea cucumber farming in Madagascar. So sea cucumbers we saw on the first slide, if you don't know, they're little animals that live on and around coral reefs, and they can be ranched like you might ranch cattle or sheep, but in very tiny little pens in shallow water. And this is what they look like when you pull them out, for example, to do monitoring of them. And they can get quite big. They start about, when we get the juveniles, they start about as big as your fingernail, and then over 6 to 9 months, they'd get quite big, and they fetch a very good price on the market. So, using this example, we can start with our theory of change for this learning group. And then you can start to contextualize this, right? So apply it. So what is specific for our situation? We have supporting a sea cucumber enterprise, right? And then we start to look at what are the enabling conditions for a sea cucumber enterprise. This is being a first draft. Maybe we come up with, people need inputs. They need the juvenile sea cucumbers. They need the materials for the fencing. They need some technical capacity. And then our next assumption might be, okay, once they've got those enabling conditions, they'll start to farm the sea cucumbers. And then they'll receive income from the sea cucumber farms. Then when they're generating income from the sea cucumber farms, they'll have less need for fishing effort or to go fishing, so they'll reduce their fishing effort. And that will reduce overfishing on the reef, which is the primary threat to the reef fish populations and the coral reef habitat, which is the thing that we're trying to conserve. So that's our example, or our starting point. And then what we can do from there is, sorry, I think I missed one. We can think about, yes, what are we trying to achieve? From here, we might want to pull in some more information. So understanding from stakeholders, from others who have done similar projects, how does this theory of change work? What's necessary? There's a resource that we've produced from this learning group called Building a Conservation Enterprise, Keys for Success, which is a great resource for anyone designing or starting a project or managing one. And within this is a checklist for conservation enterprises. So the enabling conditions that that are commonly necessary, and then some prompting questions to help you think about those enabling conditions and identify any gaps that you might have. So using that, we could start to adapt our theory of change. So one of the questions there is what infrastructure is in place for the enterprise to meet production and transportation needs. So thinking more about that, we might realize that we need a private sector partner to be buying these sea cucumbers from the community members, because there's no way for them to easily transport those. So that might be an enabling condition that we can add. We might think of some other things, and that would produce a fuller theory of change. Again, I'm keeping this simple because this is an example that we're going to use just to work with. Okay, so once we're here, then going back to what we're trying to achieve, then we can start to identify some outcomes and some indicators that we want to see from this project, both on, what are we trying to or hoping to see in terms of our conservation targets, or biodiversity focal interests, and then on our threats. And we could keep going back on to all of our results to identify what are those key indicators and outcomes that we need to see. So outcomes being smart, measurable, or specific, measurable, achievable results, time-bounded objectives that we can place on there. I think many of you are familiar with this from doing other forms of monitoring. So we can use this for that structure. And then to keep going, we want to be thinking about, okay, we know what we want to achieve, but what are our knowledge gaps? So what do we already know? And then what don't we know? So what are your information needs around implementation and performance? What does your team need to know in order to adapt and manage the approach? And think about what level of rigor is needed. And what evidence do you need on the effectiveness of the strategy towards your desired outcome? What do your other stakeholders want to know? What level of rigor do they need? So there's one sort of questions internally, what do you need to manage your project? But also if you need to get other stakeholders and bring them along, then you want to be thinking about their information needs as well. And then what other or alternative approaches might be needed. So we don't want to consider just this in isolation, recognizing that our strategy might not, this strategic approach might not be enough, or it might not be the right strategic approach for the problem. Okay, and you can do some of this brainstorming right here on your theory of change. So we might think, okay, we already know that viable enterprises are generating income for villagers. Maybe we've done a pilot and we see that when we set these up, then they generate significant income. So we already know that. Maybe we plan to do some social marketing to go to scale and to bring more households into the program, but we're not sure what the most effective way is to reach our audiences. So that's one gap that we might have. Right? Then maybe we've got a gap around a key assumption about whether increasing income is really going to lead to reducing fishing effort. And then maybe we're also wondering, if we can reduce fishing effort, will this be enough to sustain the fisheries or the reef fish populations and the coral reef habitat? And from these, we can start to do a first draft with some questions. So that first one doesn't need one because we already know that, but this second question, so not sure the effective way to reach audiences, we can draft a question like, what's the best way to reach the target audiences? And maybe we're thinking we could use posters or we could use radio. And then our first draft on our key assumption, we're not sure if these two results are linked. We might think, okay, does sea cucumber income lead to reduced fishing effort? And then our last one, if effort is reduced, will it sustain the reef fish populations in the coral reef habitat? We can be thinking about, okay, by how much do we need to reduce fishing in order for fisheries to recover? So now we've got some draft questions. Now it's time to start to work with these to prioritize and then refine. So here's some ideas about how to prioritize within a question. And if you're doing this for an actual project, you might have a list of 20, 30, you can generate quite a number of knowledge gaps and initial learning questions. So how do you pare these down to what's manageable? So first you want to be thinking about what is feasible. Can we answer it within the life of the project? And do we have the resources to be able to answer? Some questions might just be too big for whatever activity is being planned. Then thinking about, okay, how important is it that we satisfy this this question or fill this knowledge gap? Is this already known in some ways, maybe by other people, and we just need to find that out? Or which parts really don't we know, and we want to focus in on those areas. And then also think about what's the risk if we don't get an answer? Because there may be some things that the risk is relatively low, and some things where it's high, where if we don't get an answer, we won't know what to do, and we may not get the results that we're looking for. And then lastly, relevance to decision making. I think this is really important. We really want to have a learning agenda that has questions that are going to give clear direction to those managing the project or those who might follow in your footsteps or those who might try and take this to scale. And then we can start thinking about how much rigor is needed for these learning questions here. Once you've narrowed down the list, you can start to refine and think about making these questions more specific and answerable. And it helps to be adding in the subject or population of interest into that question so you're sure. Thinking about what is the outcome of interest that you have in mind for this question or this result that you're wondering about. And then what factors explain or predict the outcome of interest. So being clear about possible explanations that you're investigating. And then keeping in mind comparison to other groups or alternative explanations, and especially for causal claims. So you want to understand a causal claim, you want to not just understand the correlation, but also if something is causing something else, then you need to be able to rule out other things that might be causing that aren't the thing you're focused on. As you start to refine questions, it can look something like this. So we had a question of what's the best way to reach the target audiences, and making this more specific and answerable. We might have something like, okay, among villages in the project area, which marketing channels are most cost-effective at reaching female heads of household? So you can get more specific about who we're trying to reach, and that will give us a more answerable question that's hopefully more relevant. Does sea cucumber income lead to reduced fishing effort? It's relatively broad. We could get a little bit more specific about for participating households, as income from sea cucumbers increases, does fishing effort decrease? And then we can start to match this onto our, or map this onto our theory of change, right? Not everything needs to be tied to one of these assumptions. This is an important point I want to make here, is that there is, you certainly can look through a results chain, and every arrow is an assumption, and those assumptions are very important, an assumption about the logic. So you could potentially generate a learning question from every one of those assumptions. And that's a good idea, but we also want to be thinking more broadly about other information needs that we might have. So this one on the bottom here, this is on how we're going to carry out an activity, right? We also could have a learning question around our focal interests. So what is the status of our biodiversity focal interest, right? Or about our problem, right? So is overfishing a key threat? Or about this solution, strategic approach versus another. So there's lots of areas in which we can have learning questions, including these assumptions that we build into our results chain. So once we've got our learning questions, we want to think about how are we going to answer them. And there's lots of ways that you can answer learning questions. I think we often immediately think about monitoring data, which is a good way to answer learning questions. But there are other options as well. You can do informal assessments or qualitative assessments. You can do a pause and reflect meetings. So, building in times in your project where you bring stakeholders and project team together to reflect on what's happening, to get input and to try and adapt and manage your project. That's a great way to learn, and a very cost-effective way to do so. There's peer-to-peer sharing, that you can do exchange visits. There's also the evaluations, performance evaluations and impact evaluations. With impact evaluations being a little bit different because usually you're specifically looking at causal claims. So trying to pull out attribution and understand what was your impact or the impact of your project by looking at other areas where the project didn't occur. And here I want to stop and just quickly make a point about the difference between learning questions and evaluation questions. And this is something we've thought a lot about, we've talked to PPL about, and where we've sort of landed on this is that evaluation questions are a specific type of learning questions. So they're like a bucket within the larger category of learning questions. Evaluation questions are just those questions that are tied specifically to the conduct of a performance evaluation or an impact evaluation. So you can use evaluation questions to answer your learning questions. And the structure of them could be the same, whichever way you go. So it's just about how you're investigating them. So an example of learning through monitoring. So once we've got our learning questions, we've got this up at the top. For participating households, as income from sea cucumbers increases, does fishing effort decrease? And this is an example of one that is on an assumption between two results. We can identify our information needs, changes in household income over the life cycle of sea cucumber production on one side, and on the other side, changes in household fishing effort over the life cycle of sea cucumber production. And we'd want to compare these. You can imagine we could develop a number of metrics that would be able to monitor on each side. And it's important here when developing your methods to be really thinking specifically about the unit of analysis. So to think about, should we be measuring income and fishing effort at the household level, at the individual level, at the community level? What's the right unit for our analysis? And that's going to depend on your context, the audiences you're trying to reach, the specific question that you need to answer. But that definitely needs to be thought about intentionally. So with your monitoring methods, you could do ongoing monitoring, but there are other ways that you could do it. And this comes from my actual experience with the sea cucumbers. We did a lot of specific monitoring at a household level of both of these variables. And it's very time-consuming and expensive. It was worthwhile, but when we scaled up our efforts to move to more villages, we just couldn't scale up that monitoring effort. And so instead, we moved to direct observation of effort. So it's relatively easy to go out in a boat and count the number of people gleaning on a reef at low tide. It's also pretty easy from the boat or on the shore to count the number of people who are tending their sea cucumber pens. So instead of monitoring fishing effort directly through household surveys, we could just observe at peak fishing times. There's really a trade-off between tending your sea cucumbers and being out on the reef fishing. We could do a visual count that was a lot more cost-effective. But you could also do key informant interviews. That's another way. So those are examples of learning through monitoring. But you could also, with the same question, and these aren't mutually exclusive, you could also use other learning activities. So you could do a review of literature on this. You could look at past projects or other similar projects and see how this relationship worked. You could do pause and reflect meetings with your stakeholders to see what their experience is of this. You could do something like outcome mapping, where you're looking at changes that have occurred and then trying to understand how these changes came about. And then you could also do fisher exchanges to try and, if you've got other communities that are more advanced in the project, you can bring newer communities to them to be learning from each other, to be understanding what's happening. So as you start to identify learning activities, you also want to you don't want to stop there. You want to keep going to be as specific as possible with developing a plan and thinking about, okay, we've got these learning activities, but what are we actually going to produce in terms of knowledge products? So what knowledge products do we need and for what audience? And then also thinking about the experiential learning, what activities are we going to do and what are they going to look like? And the more that we can think about this up front, the better and more, the easier it's going to be to implement your monitoring, evaluation, and learning plan. And then as you're doing that, you want to be orienting both the knowledge products and your experiential learning to decision makers and the decisions that need to happen, either the decisions related to your implementation or decisions related to other people, helping other people to understand what's happened and how they could follow in your footsteps. So summing this all together, then we started with our theory of change and what we were hoping to achieve. We generated some learning questions based on knowledge gaps that we had. Then we identified learning activities that we could use to address these. And then we thought about specifically what knowledge products do we want to produce, what activities do we want to do, and what decisions are we hoping to inform. And all of this is building towards sort of a different or a more CLA approach to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. So I'm just going to run through real quickly in these slides, showing how sometimes to understand where you're trying to go, it helps to start by understanding what sort of the business as usual case is, or where you don't want to stay. And so just contrasting sort of the business as usual case with where we're trying to go. So, for example, currently, MEL plans are often a long list of quantitative indicators. And what we want to try and move towards is theories of change with clear learning priorities. Currently, we've got a lot of output-oriented focus within learning plans, focused on what's happened and less on the impact. We want to move towards understanding the impact, and then also, really importantly, understanding why, how, and under what conditions, and to what effect. And then currently we've got M&E that's very donor-driven and focused internally on aspects of program implementation. And we want to move towards M&E that's focused on and owned by local stakeholders, and monitoring that includes context monitoring. And then finally, right now we've got evaluations that are very check-the-box exercises with little ownership from those managing them. And the timing of M&E deliverables is periodic and predetermined. Usually aligned with larger reporting deadlines or processes in the mission. And we want to be moving towards evaluations designed with end users in mind, and M&E efforts timed to dovetail with key programmatic decision-making points. Right? So again, hitting that the decisions are informed by evidence. So that's my last slide, and I'm going to hand it back over to Megan to facilitate the group discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Shawn. That was a great presentation about kind of where we're trying to go with MENL using a TOC approach. I'd really like to hear from you all now, and particularly Luis. I know you are about ready to have a very busy year talking about enterprise approaches in Central America. I would love to know kind of like, how are you thinking about using MENL in your enterprise program, and kind of what barriers are you thinking about in developing that plan that we need to help overcome?
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the opportunity. Yes, we are very excited. We just signed our new regional coastal biodiversity project that is going to be a 5-year, $14 million project that is going to tackle biodiversity conservation in mangroves and upstream related ecosystems in 3 sites. The mangroves of the mouth of rivers bordering the river of Motagua between Guatemala and Honduras, River Paz between El Salvador and Guatemala, and the Mosquito Coast between Honduras and Nicaragua. And one interesting thing about is that this presents to USAID in general a very exciting opportunity to test pretty much whether conservation enterprises work or not. We have done this, as it has been mentioned before by Megan and Shawn, many times, not just in USAID, but in the conservation world in general. And because it makes sense, but we don't have true evidence, or at least there is information, obviously, some cases that are successful, some others that doesn't seem to be so successful. And we are excited that this will be an opportunity to test it, because in addition to the project, the mission here has agreed to have an impact evaluation. The good thing about this, all this happening at the same time, including this webinar, is that we have tried to follow the conservation enterprises theory of change. The selected implementing partner, IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, actually used by themselves the open standards model and the theory of change to build up their theory of change. So we are happy that we are in an alignment. Trying to respond a bit more directly your question, again, is that we are definitely going to try to pair up and reanalyze that theory of change. We are going to have a starting workshop with you guys, with people from E3 and LAC, with the implementing partner, to have another look of the theory of change and revise it. And actually, I was hesitating in my head whether should I include or not the group of the impact evaluation team within this workshop. And now I know I have, after hearing this presentation, to make sure that the design is concurrent with not just the monitoring of the project itself, but actually aligning the monitoring and evaluation process and learning process with the impact evaluation. What barriers have we thought of to overcome? That's a very heavy question that I don't have an answer yet. I don't think we have identified the barriers, but having this initial setup and having the impact evaluation at the very beginning together with the project, it's the ideal situation. And I think that will do two things at least: identify the barriers and identify how to reduce their risks. So I'm going to stop there to see if there are other questions about it.
Great. Does anyone else have any questions about the content of the presentation, or questions for Luis? Or I would love to hear who else out there is working on enterprises or livelihoods in your programs. You might have to type in the chat box. I'm not sure, Judy, if everyone is still muted.
Before everybody figures out how to respond, let me add that one of the components of this new project is precisely the promotion of what we have referred to as biocommerce, which is just another word of conservation enterprises. We just wanted to look innovative, so we changed the name. So that is a big component of it. We are doing two big things. It has four components, four objectives. The main one is to promote biocommerce, and the second one is to follow this through science-based evidence data collection, and promote the enhanced capacities on science-based data collection among the local people. We have a component on governance, biodiversity conservation governance, and trying to do this in a climate smart way to take into account climatic variability.
Carlos, I think you're muted right now, but I think that alternative livelihoods and kind of income generation is something that you work on a lot. Do you have any kind of reactions for us, or anything that you want to say? I think you might have yourself on mute. And I throw that out to anyone else too, who has any kind of comments that you'd like to make or questions. Carlos, I think we should be able to hear you now. If you're talking, could you try to type in the chat box? So Christy or Karen, any comments? I think we'll just go ahead.
Can you hear me, Megan?
I can hear you.
Maybe something's going on because I wanted to type something in the chat and I was not allowed. So maybe Carlos is having some troubles either making himself heard or type. I cannot type anymore.
I don't know if John or Judy, can you tell what the issue is? You can see my typing.
Yeah, I was able to see your typing, Megan.
Okay, I think Carlos might be having some technical problems potentially with his computer or his phone. I think I'm gonna, unless anybody has anything else burning that they want to say, I might just move us on to the final slides, which are just mainly a few news updates and prompts.
This is Christy. I don't have any major comments to add other than that this is really helpful, and I think this is really timely for the LAC region. As you can see, there's so many of us on today. In our region, we certainly are doing a lot of work on conservation enterprise, and so it's really useful to have the checklist and sort of this thought process to try to strengthen what we're doing and make sure that we're getting good information to feed into future programs and other regions and just improve our decision making. So thanks.
Sure. You know, we have a lot of resources on the links that you will see earlier up in the chat box on our microsite for the learning groups. You also have access to resources at Measuring Impact and ourselves here in E3Fab. We are building up a cohort of advisors who can work with you on these programs. So if you would like something more customized to your particular mission and your particular activity, that can be as short as a phone call to go over the resources, or as long as actually providing facilitation for meetings with your partners, helping you think through your plans, and then helping you set up evaluations or learning agendas as well. I think what we really want, and the whole purpose of the learning group, is to help apply these concepts to your programs, and we just want you all to know that we'd be happy to work with you on that. Any other questions? Yes. Luis is thanking Carlos for the work of the Maria project that Carlos worked on. And Carlos, I don't know if you're trying to say something. Are you still there? So I think if you can go on to the next slide, Shawn. Do you want to walk us through the resources?
Sure. Great. So we've got coming down the pipe, we've got a Conservation Enterprise newsletter, which I think will go out today. So look for that with some links to a bunch of key resources that we've recently produced. And then we're also working on a retrospective analysis of conservation enterprises, which is really exciting undertaking where we're looking at a number of enterprises around the world that have been in existence for over 20 years and trying to understand what lessons, what impact have these enterprises had over this long lifespan, and what can we learn from comparing across these different enterprises in different contexts to sort of pull out to help us understand conservation enterprises in a lot more depth. So be on the lookout for products in the next few months related to Conservation Enterprise Retrospective. And then we have right now a number of resources up on our website, and Judy has put the link in the chat there. to the Conservation Enterprise Learning Group website. Measuring Impact also has a number of resources, including how-to guides that walk through in a lot more detail the process that I walked through with this Conservation Enterprise example, but more generally for any conservation approach. How can you do monitoring, integrated monitoring, evaluation, and then finally, USAID's Learning Lab. You can also find a number of resources related to collaborating, learning, and adapting.
Great. Well, thank you, Shawn. I did just want to give a shout out to the folks in the Learning Lab and TPL for helping us with some of the slides today. If you haven't looked at the Learning Lab site, there's a lot of great resources out there on how to create learning agendas. And also, Monica just asked a question about when the Conservation Enterprise retrospective analysis will be done. Judy is just back from visiting 6 sites. And I think after some very well-deserved annual leave over the holidays, we'll be working on getting those final products out early next year. Any other final comments or last words from anybody?
Yeah, yes, I do have a comment on the presentation, actually, because it made me think of a lot of things, but just to round it up, of what probably caught my attention the most is the fact that we should look for the most final outcome when we are trying to test our evidence. In the presentation, Shawn's presentation, and in a great effort on sea cucumber approaches, but I saw that the effect on conservation was tested by looking at the fishing effort, whether that had decreased. But it made me think how directly that is linked to the overall outcome of biodiversity conservation. I mean, we can we have to infer that a reduced fishing effort will have a positive effect on biodiversity, but maybe we should also add some testing of has fish population actually increased. There could be some, I mean, hypothetically, I can think of some sea cucumber farming affecting the coral health of the ecosystem, and we might have some confounding evidence. And this is challenging because we always struggle between the quality of the data that we get and the money that we have. I guess that has been the major issue so far. But to whatever extent possible, we should try to be as focused on the rigor of science that is applied as much as possible, and try to test or question the quality of the data that we're getting, especially when that comes from secondary data, when we get information from works that other people have done. At least in the case of Central America, I think even though there have been, I would say, hundreds of studies, these are more on the gray type of papers, not necessarily peer review, and they tend to cite other works, and getting to the original source, it's sometimes difficult. So I'm beginning to question the amount of reliable information that we have, because sometimes many people say, well, we have done a bunch of studies, enough of studies, we should get hands-on. But I don't think we do have enough information here, and that's what I'm basing our project on, getting some real science-based evidence. So I just wanted to point that out.
No, thanks for that point, Luis, and I think it's an excellent one. And it's kind of, I almost call it the holy grail of our theory of change.
There you go.
And I really wish Carl Wooster would have been on the line today, because he's also doing a similar evaluation and impact evaluation for enterprises in Nepal. I think we featured him in a webinar a couple of months ago, so that recording is on the learning site. And he is really struggling with how to collect data and reliable evidence on the far right side of that chain through forest monitoring and just how to do that in a cost-effective way. I think with technology, there's been so much advances in how you can collect some of that information, and all of the points that you talked about using secondary data and actually linking this enterprise approach that we're doing with biodiversity funds to an actual conservation result is definitely a key question. Carlos did put some comments there in the chat box. Thank you for that, Carlos. All of those are great points, especially the value chain comment around the enabling conditions at the very beginning to really understand the market. Judy, did you have any comments on that?
We're just finding that to be really relevant at all the sites that we visited through the retrospective and all the literature review that we've done. A really important aspect.
Yeah, I think in the Philippines in particular, having the rights to that product and how to manage the rights to that product was really important.
I would add that in the sea cucumber example, it was a private sector partner that was providing the juveniles, that was sending a truck out to purchase them, that was really doing the critical steps in the value chain, which made this whole thing possible. So yeah, they were really the linchpin.
Well, thank you everyone for your participation, particularly everybody. I know Lisa is in West Africa, but all of the LAC participants, we've been trying to do this with you guys for a while, so I really appreciate you getting online and spending this hour of your day with us. And I wish everyone happy holidays, a good rest period, I hope, and a happy new year. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.